Hi, today we're going to take a look at 1 Nephi 5, verses 1 to 9, moving along at a breakneck speed. This chapter begins with the story of Sariah's complaint and objections. Basically, women in the Book of Mormon don't tend to be very developed figures. They appear occasionally. But here you get a little insight into what it was like to be the wife of a visionary prophet in 600 BC. Basically, uh, she finally objects and reacts to Lehi because she thinks her sons had perished. Now, probably what happened is they returned from the camp to Jerusalem. Then they expected them to have a day or two to get the plates and then to come back. So they knew maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it would take. And as the time went beyond that, that is, it took longer for them to get the plates than they had expected, and they end up taking longer. So when they don't return by the expected time, Sariah starts to worry. And she complains in exactly the same term with the issues that we find Laman and Lemuel complaining about in chapter 2, verse 11. First of all, she complains that Lehi was a visionary man. Now, in one context, that should be a positive thing, but in another context, if you're a crazy visionary man, then that's a negative thing. So he's essentially having these false visions, and he's acting on them, and this is causing huge problems for their family. Their sons are dead because of his visions. They've lost the land of their inheritance, and they're all going to die out here in the wilderness. So she's basically had a complete collapse, emotionally is distraught and rejects Lehi. We're not quite sure how much she believed him in the first place. Now, this tale is developed in Camille Frank's article, Desert Epiphany, a very sympathetic view of Sariah and the issues she faced. But basically, she's on Laman and Lemuel's side in this one. We also note that Sariah is an authentic ancient Near Eastern name, so we should be aware of that. I won't go into the details, but it's been found in very contemporary documents. It's an authentic Hebrew name, Jewish name, found in the Elephantine papyri from the 6th century BC. But that's as close as you can get. It's non-biblical. So we have then Sariah here complaining, objecting, and essentially rejecting Lehi temporarily. Now we could also take a moment here, now that we've introduced Sariah a little bit, to look at her family and Lehi's family. We don't have any detailed information about their age or anything like that, other than the relative order of who was born first and so forth. We can, however, get some hints from knowledge of social customs at the time, of Jewish social customs. We can see what their family structure would have kind of been like. First of all, we note that none of Lehi's children seem to have been married by 597 BC. That is, when they leave, they don't bring their wives and grandchildren with them. They just bring their children, and they have to go back to get them wives. So none of them are married. What that means is probably Laman, the oldest, is at most in his early 20s and maybe even in his 20s. Nephi says he's a young man, probably a mid-teenager or something like that. Make Laman maybe 18. So we get the sense then that the family is actually pretty young. If you look at those wonderful old Freeburg paintings in the old editions of the Book of Mormon, you see Lehi and Sariah as these very old, 70-year-old people. They're not. They're in their late 30s or early 40s. It's pretty clear from the text. That's the age range we're talking about. Now, young women in the Near East at this time could marry in their mid-teens, early teens even. And so Sariah was probably, if she had a 20-year-old son in 597, it means she's maybe, got married at 15 or 16, she's maybe 35 to 40, something like that. That would be her age. Lehi's probably a bit older because men tended to marry older than women. And so Lehi was maybe from 40 to 45. So these are not old, decrepit people like they're depicted in the paintings sometimes. These are middle-aged and physically able to make this type of journey. This also tells us a little bit about the social context of Lehi, because he was born around 40 BC. That's just about the time that Josiah becomes king of Jerusalem. So he's just a little bit younger than Josiah, who became king when he was 8 years old. Now, the reforms of Josiah occurred in 623 BC, so Lehi would have been around 20, maybe late teens at the time of the Josiah's reforms. So he lived through this very dramatic and dynamic period of Jewish history. When the kingdom starts to collapse, you have these huge religious reforms and religious stress and strain between different factions, and then the coming of Egyptians and Babylonians devastating the countryside, and a whole series of wars going on, and the death of King Josiah in battle. So Lehi was living through these remarkable times, and very prophetic times, because we have both Jeremiah and Ezekiel coming on the scene as prophets. Now, it's said that Lehi died before year 30. It's not quite clear how many years before, but sometime before year 30, and that would make him about 70 or maybe 75 years old when he dies. So that seems to fit very well in everything we know. We also know that since Sariah had a couple of extra kids on the trail in Arabia, she couldn't have been in her 50s or 60s. We're talking about a woman who's still capable of bearing children. So that, we don't know these things for certain, but if you put all the pieces together, that seems to be about what the family structure and age and so forth of Lehi's family was. Okay, we're in a situation now where Sariah has made a serious objection and condemnation of Lehi, and now we get Lehi's defense. And basically he gives two defenses for himself. First of all, he agrees that he's a visionary man, but he says these are true things. These are the things of God. Now, it's interesting. Things in Hebrew is deber, debarim, and that word, debarim in plural, means word or thing. So he's seen the things of God, or he's seen the words of God. In Hebrew, it's exactly the same word, debar, debarim. So he's seen these things of God, or words of God, in this vision. So in other words, he's saying, yes, I'm a visionary man, but I'm a real visionary man. And if we had stayed behind in Jerusalem, we would have all been destroyed in the coming Holocaust of the Babylonian invasion. So that's his first defense, is that he admits he's a visionary man, but he's a true visionary man. His second defense is that he has obtained a land of promise. That is, okay, we've lost the land of inheritance. That was Sariah's complaint. But we have received a land of promise. Now, there is no account of Lehi having a covenant for a land of promise like Nephi does in 2:20, but Lehi doesn't. So it may be in the book of Lehi he talks about receiving a land of promise, or it may be that he saw Nephi's covenant as applying to him as well. But the point is, he's responding to the second objection. We've lost the land of our inheritance, okay, but we've received a land of promise. So we're really not losing out here. We're going to be saved from death. We're going to get a land replacement for the lost land of inheritance. And then finally, he makes a prophecy. I know the Lord will deliver Laban and save the sons. That is to say, they're coming back. So he makes this prophecy, and this is very important because we'll see in a minute, when the prophecy becomes true, Sariah is convinced of his prophetic and visionary status. So that's Lehi's response. It gives us a good insight into what he's thinking and what's going on here. But we also have the interesting idea of what it is to be a visionary man. That phrase is, although the word vision occurs in the Old Testament, in the King James Version, the word visionary does not. Now, in the King James Version, we've got a problem because there are two different Hebrew words which are translated as a single English word. The first word is ro'eh, which means seer, and the second is chotzeh, which means visionary, or person who sees a vision. Now, these two words overlap in Hebrew concept, but basically the verb ra'ah, from which ro'eh comes, means to see things with your eyes. And a roet is a seer, that is, he is a seer, one who sees things. Now, the chatzah verb means to behold, but it's almost always, or most of the time, is used in some revelatory sense. Roet can be an ordinary thing that you see in ordinary life or revelatory, but chatzah is generally some type of revelatory sense behind it. So, the visionary is a chatzah. To see a vision is chatzah, and the vision itself is called a chatzon, or sometimes a chatzion. A chatzayon, excuse me. Anyway, these visions then, there's two different concepts in Hebrew that define these ideas, and it's interesting that the Book of Mormon just doesn't say he's a seer. He says he's a visionary man. In other words, it's probably not translating roet, but chatzah. And here the Book of Mormon seems to reflect, in the way it translates, a conceptual division within Hebrew that it's not clear in the King James Version, but it is clear in the Hebrew behind the King James Version. And the Book of Mormon seems to reflect this. So that's kind of interesting in that regard. So a visionary man is one who sees visions of the mysteries of God. This is something that transcends ordinary inspiration. And that's what Lehi is talking about himself as a visionary man. Now, the objections of Laman, Lemuel, and Sariah against Lehi are based on the problem of the false visionaries. And this is made very clear in the Bible, in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that there were lots of prophets running around prophesying and declaring visions and having visions, or at least claiming to have visions, that were untrue. And this created a huge problem for the people, because there were true prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Lehi, but there were also apparently lots of false prophets running around. I've given you a couple of passages there. Jeremiah talks about the prophet who lies in the name of the Lord. They prophesy a false vision. And they prophesied deceit of their heart. Notice in 23:16, Jeremiah says it's a vision of their own heart. Now that's exactly what the accusation that Sariah and Laman and Lemuel give against Lehi is that these are, vain imaginings of his heart. This is coming out of his imagination. He's hallucinating or delusional or something. And notice there's a couple other passages I've listed there that you can take a look at that give some further similar references. But notice what's going on here is we have a problem with false visionaries. And so this creates a problem for Lehi's family. Is this guy lunatic, or is he a real visionary? And that's what's reflected in these objections to Lehi, this social religious background of the false visionaries. Now, there's some interesting articles on visionaries and a visionary man that are listed there. The best one's probably Fetness, but there's a lot of good stuff in some of those articles, so you can take a look for further reading behind those. Okay, Nephi, Laman, and Lemuel do return with the plates, and Sariah is comforted. She's filled with joy. She's overwhelmed with happiness. Her family's returned safely. And then she says in 5:8, "Now I know of a surety that the Lord has commanded these things." Now she knows of a surety because Lehi's prophecy of their safe return had been fulfilled. Remember, Lehi makes a prophecy in 5:5. They're going to come back with the plates. And when they do, Sariah says, "Okay, I know you're a true prophet now. I know of a surety that because they have returned safely and your prophecy has been fulfilled." So Sariah now is fully on the side of Lehi. Her objections, her concerns are satisfied in this regard. Now, when the family returns, there's also a very important thing that occurs, and that's a ritual response to this situation. Basically, your average New York farm boy in 1820s, when they returned safely from a voyage or a journey, their natural inclination was not to go offer sacrifice and burnt offerings. That just wasn't part of the culture of the period. In fact, this is quite typical of the Near East or of Jewish society of the age to offer sacrifice for thanksgiving and also burnt offerings for sin offerings. So notice in 5:9, these things are very just hints in the background, but they're very clear what's going on. There's two different offerings given. One is they offer a sacrifice, and the second is they offer a burnt offering, and then they give thanks. Now that's not clear if that's a different sacrifice or giving thanks is part of the sacrifice. Anyway, so there's two sacrifices they do, an ordinary sacrifice and a burnt offering. And the sacrifice is very mentioned in conjunction with giving thanks. It's very likely that this is a thanksgiving or a peace offering described in Leviticus 17 there. And then they also say they gave burnt offerings. Now notice that in the first sacrifice Lehi offers in the wilderness, it's there's no burnt offering mentioned, only sacrifice. The second one, he does offer a burnt offering. And notice what burnt offering is for. It's for atonement from sin. In Leviticus 1:2-4 and 5:7 talks about giving a burnt offering as an atonement for sin. And basically the sin is Nephi slaying Laban. That is, he's shed blood. And so he needs to make a burnt offering to atone for that sin. And that's what they do. They offer a burnt offering. So it's very interesting that the very brief verse, almost just mentioned in passing, fits perfectly within the context of ancient Jewish sacrifice ideology, that you give thanksgiving offerings to thank the Lord for whatever successful thing has occurred, and you give a burnt offering as atonement for sin. Now it's interesting too that Nephi conceptualized and Lehi conceptualized the slaying of Laban as a sin. Notice that God commanded it to be done. It was a justifiable act to save their lives, but it was still a sin. And that's very interesting. We don't think of things in those terms, but the ancient Hebrews or Jews tended to do so. That is, even a justified act of certain sorts could be sins, just as a inadvertent impurity that comes upon you is still an impurity, even if it's not your fault that you accidentally, fell in a tomb or something and got in contact with dead bodies, which renders a priest impure. Doesn't matter if it's an accident, it still needs to be rectified. And that's the same case, I think, in this particular situation. And the Brown article talks about these sacrifices in more detail, gives a good understanding of what's going on with Lehi's sacrifices. So we'll end it here, and we'll continue on with the rest of chapter 5 later on.